Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you on a complex problem of our societies as we pay the price of trying to establish security and an atmosphere of serenity around the world. And as such, although we can find ourselves throwing a lot of cash at these things, much of it is also in sweat and tears and sometimes the blood of our youth, as well as the long-term impact of these commitments in these many imploding nations and failing states. And particularly in this era, the post-modern era, and the complexities and ambiguities of missions and tasks of this time. I am going to use every pedagogical tool I can to present to you, because I'm not an academic. I'm a soldier, and we're very visual people. You rarely see an Army officer without a map, and you also see in the eyes of his soldiers the hope that the map the officer is carrying is of the area in which they find themselves. But that's not necessarily always the case. I am going to do a bit of history, and as we talked at lunchtime, I'm going to go a little farther than CNN history, which is last week, in order to set the stage for the reality of the impact of operational stress on not only the troops who are committed, and more female troops that are committed, as it is nearly a new dimension in regards to looking at veterans, looking at the fact that women are veterans, and they are veterans in their own right in as much as they are in combat in this era, and not back in the UK or somewhere holding the fort and doing the typewriters, but they're actually in the front lines, also engaged in full combat roles. And in Canada, we had our first combat arms female officer, an artillery forward observer, calling down fire on a position in Afghanistan to protect the soldiers that were with her, and was killed in doing that by an RPG. And so women are now fully in the commitment of our missions. And so how do we handle that angle of the scenario? How do we handle the situation where both spouses are deployed, or one after another, and coming back with the impact of those deployments on their family? Those are realities that we have, I'm afraid, stumbled into and not anticipated. And because of that, I consider that a weakness of our leadership, of not being able to anticipate some of this stuff and prepare the terrain for the impacts of that. And so many of the casualties since really the first Gulf War, which is the new era of conflict, 1991, many are casualties that have been abandoned, forsaken, and too many have also gone to the extreme of even taking their lives through suicides due to their inability to handle the pressures, but mostly the pain of their injuries. So I'm going to speak to you about the whole realm of post-traumatic stress disorder, and do it in a very short period of time with 143 slides, but I'll try to reduce that. And I'll do what my Marine Corps friends taught me. I will try to power talk my way through this so that there's time for questions thereafter. And I think the first thing that I would want to indicate to you is the fact that I am an officer who was medically released from the Canadian Forces because of operational stress injury, or PTSD. And I commanded every level up to Deputy Commander of the Army, and in my release after 36 years, there was only one line written on the medical form, and it said, "This officer cannot command troops anymore in operations." And the reason being not being able to sustain the stresses of operations and as such would become a liability to his command. And so I speak to you not only as a person who has been in command positions and also as Assistant Deputy Minister of all personnel for the Canadian Forces totally, but also now as the chair of the Veterans Committee in the Canadian Senate and as a retired general, of course. I have 3 children who are serving, and one of them has been already in Africa, in Sierra Leone and in Haiti, and so that generation and the impact on them is also part of the background that I have. So the exercise in which we want to spend a bit of time this afternoon is recognizing that we are facing soldiers and their families who have come back from operations injured, not sick, injured. And one of the first elements that we had to face in the 90s, when we realized that we had totally abandoned and had no capabilities of handling operational stress or post-PTSD because we had been at peace for so long, is the fact that if we were calling it anything else than an injury, in the very Darwinian milieu that the military is in, and you'll find that also within the police forces or firemen and so on, the emergency people, in such a Darwinian organization that seeks 100% and is very, particularly on things it can't see, like that it cannot see, if you went anywhere near the term a mental illness, or that it is a mental problem, a mental health problem, you guaranteed no one would come to the door. And so the first thing was to make this injury honorable, for it was perceived as not an honorable injury. A very rapid anecdote is in the early 60s when I was serving, we still had veterans of Korea and World War II. And I remember one Friday night in particular, and it happened often, but this one in particular, where it's happy hour, and in those days we enjoyed happy hour massively, and there was a lot of drinking going on. And we were drinking at the bar, and this major who had been a veteran, we were talking, and he finally let slip out that he had been injured in Korea. And we immediately wanted to know, what was your injury? And I mean, if he'd been hit by something, his body had been affected, it was an honor to have survived such an injury. And we finally got him convinced to tell us what it was, and he showed us that he had been shot through a thigh. And we bought beer for him for months after that. I mean, he was very much a hero to us. However, at the same time, that although he didn't want to show it, but he did indicate that, there were other officers sitting in the back of the sort of the snake pit, as we called it, where the happy hour was, and they were slowly getting loaded, but always with a lip on, and always very nasty and unsavory. They were also injured, but nobody really wanted to talk to them, and we didn't really want to get engaged with them. But they had been psychologically injured, and they were living that isolationism that they were living. And that brought me back home when I came back from Africa with my injury and was going through the steps of trying to figure out what to do about it, that it reminded me of my father, who had been a career soldier, joined the Army in 1928, had gone overseas, spent 6 years overseas, come back, served again, and then retired. And my father was a very violent man. He also drank a lot, and was very, very emotionally sort of in extremes. And I could never really figure out why he had been so difficult. But then, as I understood what had happened to me, I remember him bringing me every now and again to the LGen on a Saturday afternoon. Same thing, you got your American Legion. And he would give me 25 cents and I'd play on the pinball machine and something. But then he'd be sitting at a small table with 5 or 6 other veterans, table full of beer, but they would be either laughing their head off at God knows what anecdote, war story that they had, which they had turned into something that they could at least laugh at in those circumstances. Or there would be one of them crying, and the others would be assisting him and helping him. We knew that evening that there would be serenity in the family. That my father would, not because he was drunk, he wasn't, but because he had had his session of therapy with his peers, that they were listening to him and he listened to them, that he was able to live that evening without the suffering of the operational stress that he had gone through and those traumas that had caused these stresses. And so the LGen was the only tool we had. And in so doing, had extraordinary limitations because it also created a lot of alcoholism and we ended up with losing a lot of people because of that. But the scale of that compared to today is rather interesting, in as much as the operational stress now, the PTSD now in this era, is deemed by many veterans as worse than what they went through because of the nature of conflict and the ethical and moral and legal dilemmas in which we have to work with in the field, and the complexities and the ambiguities of the missions is such that all rest together to create these traumas. And that's what we're going to work our way through quite rapidly this afternoon. And so this is an era that is not easy, that is not simple to dissect, and because of that, we are often thrown into complex missions of which we have very little information and very little capability. In fact, very little knowledge of. I mean, there weren't that many anthropologists in the Army in order to figure out exactly what's been going on in that country, what's it like, and so on. When I got the mission to go to Rwanda, I had been spending 30 years fighting in Central Europe, prepared to take on the Russians with very classical use of force, big armies against big armies, and one left standing would win, classic warfare. But that had not necessarily been the mission that I got with 4 days warning to go to a country that I didn't even know existed. For we had never really studied much of Africa. And Rwanda, in the middle of Africa, there was nothing. And so even when I left for New York, the only thing I had as a reference was a National Geographic article on Rwanda that was at least 10 years old, and a few bits of information that I was able to acquire from our intelligence staff who had never looked at Rwanda. It was not on our radar screen. Yet sent into the midst of a very complex situation in a complex room. So we've gone through a whole bunch of these complicated scenarios in which we are now facing this injury, operational stress injury. I put this slide up because what I did in 1997 is when the Department of National Defense, and I was a 2-star at the time in the personnel well, wanted to argue that the 11 suicides that we had recently had were not related to some of the missions that were committed and were because of other pre-factors that had established that sort of atmosphere in the individual, and so it wasn't directly related. I said that was a lie. And so I went public, and went public with not only my own injury, but with the fact that we were not handling this injury, and that we had a whole bunch of veterans and serving personnel that we were sending back into missions and had absolutely no capability of bringing them back down from that stress level and making them at least functional. So we were creating enormous risks. So what I did is I went to your Veterans Affairs headquarters on PTSD, which is in White River Junction, Vermont. Great place to put it. There you got 5 clinics around the country, and spoke with the head there, who was Dr. Matthew Friedman. And I asked him 3 questions. First question I said, we have nothing and we need help to build our capability of handling these injuries. I said, 2, the whole of the Canadian system needs to be readjusted in regards to the therapists. And do we have therapists who can handle this type of injury versus traumas from car accidents or people who have a variety of other traumas caused within normal society? Do we have people who can handle this sort of milieu, this culture, this language, this type of people, and the causes that affect them that ultimately create them? And I said the third thing is I believe that there is a difference between the traumas that commanders go through and the traumas that soldiers go through. That the dilemmas that they face at different levels create different traumas and may have to be treated differently. The first answer I got was what's on that board. They said, although 58,000 some odd had died in Vietnam, at that time, they had on their books in the order of 102,000 suicides directly related to Vietnam. So Vietnam was still killing 22 years later. And if you go to their centers, you'd swear you're back in 1971, except that all the hair is gray. And so this injury is not a temporary injury. And it is also an injury that can be lethal. That is to say, this injury can kill. So imagine that you're working in an environment that is Darwinian, as I said, and you get the soldiers who die on the battlefield that we recognize and we put their names on the monuments and they get the hero's welcome and so on. But the ones who've been injured psychologically but take their life 3 days after they're back, or a month after they're back, or in the case of one of my officers who came to Rwanda in reinforcement 14 years after they're back. Are they part of the casualties? Are they, in fact, people who have not done their duty, or people who have suffered an injury that we were not able to attenuate, to control, and ultimately they died of their own hand, yes, but they died because of that injury? And so there's a fundamental debate within the institution in regards to whether or not you recognize these as casualties. So how many after Iraq, how many after Afghanistan have in fact committed suicide due to the injuries of maybe not even one mission, maybe 3 or 4? There's a sergeant in my old regiment that's got 12 years in the Army. He's got 9 missions that started in Bosnia and has gone through to Afghanistan. And so we lost 157 in Afghanistan, but we estimate there's about another 40 that nobody talks about that have died directly related to that injury. Now, if you are injured in the field in Afghanistan physically and die subsequently at home from that injury, you are then on that monument. A physical injury. But why isn't this injury at that same scale? Why don't we have the same sense of urgency of trying to treat this injury and treat the people who are injured with that same level of respect and recognition? And that's that stigma that is a fundamental premise that has to be attacked. And that's one of the elements that we went head on, not only the treatment side, but how do you change the culture of the institution? And then how do you extrapolate that to the family? And I'll give you the example. When I returned from Africa, my mother-in-law was still alive at the time, and she said, you know, I would not have survived World War II if I had to go through what your family went through. And I said, why? Well, she said in World War II there were very little communications, a lot of censorship. She said the whole country was at war. Everybody was on a war footing, and very little information available. And so the war was really over there. But she said, now the family lives the conflict with the ones deployed. Because of the media, they are continuously zapping to change the channel to see if we've been shot or killed or abducted or whatever. And it took over a year in my own family that at supper time, they would talk after 6:30. Because at 6:30, a program came on in which I was often interviewed from Africa. And they never talked during that program. And although I was back, they still had this sort of state of concern about maybe speaking when I could be there. And so our families live the missions with us. So although the soldier or the service personnel come back affected and changed, for I am not the person that my wife married. I am not the father that my children knew before I left. They also changed. They also lived the stresses and traumas. And how are we taking care of them? How are we attenuating that in order for them to sustain? And so we're going to go rapidly through that. And so, fast, a bit of history. The good old days, as some people say, well, in some cases, it can be, in a macabre sort of way, that it was good. It was all European, it was all classic, it was big armies facing big armies, and everything on the periphery was noise. And we essentially bought off a lot of people on the periphery to make sure that they didn't go to war, and that way didn't drag us into a conflict with the Russians. And so things were stable, things were classic. We had centuries of experience of classic war that brought it to that sort of high level of operations. And then when the Cold War ended and we won, we sort of said that we didn't need big armies anymore. We didn't need this capability, and we started to go for the peace dividend. But there was a couple little arenas in which the Cold Warriors said, no, we got to keep doing what we used to do, and so we just train for combat. Just combat-capable forces. That's all we have to worry about, and identify the enemy. And one of those was Desert Storm. And I mean, this is a classic general's dream. Small map, big arrows, simple plan. And Schwarzkopf got up one day and looked at the sun and the entrails of a pigeon and said, go, and 700,000 people took off. With the most modern weaponry, the best training and doctrine and logistics to keep them in the field ad vitam aeternam, and he took on another army of 400,000. And these two armies clashed, and one was left standing, and that was it. Well, that, and in 2003, when the U.S. went in again into Iraq with about 130,000, are the only two times when we've seen massive use of force against classic massive use of force in a Cartesian way, you know, with tanks and minefields and so on. Everything else has not been that. Everything else has been non-classic. Every other conflict has been civil wars, massive abuses of human rights, imploding nations, and not even nation states going at each other. And so the tools of this era are not usable because they haven't necessarily been adapted to the conflicts of our time. So instead of having big war and high-tech stuff, a la Gulf War sort of thing, or even more, and the old classic peacekeeping, you know, the blue beret with the short pants, and everybody wanted them there, and no red card or penalty box. Those two don't exist. But everything in between does. So from Haiti down here, going into Cité Soleil and taking on some of the drug gangs that are run by kids, right up to Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, God knows what. And everything in between. So how do we handle this stuff? And how do we prepare in order to be effective and to reduce, of course, casualties as we do the job? And so the future ain't what it used to be, and we stumbled into it. And we are now in that future. And we're in it for a long time yet. And so I've got a lot of time for your great philosophers like Yogi Berra to have said that 50 years ago. This is far more complex now because we are now in much more revolutionary times. And so the whole scenario has changed. And I would argue, contrary to George Bush Sr., which he said at the end of the Cold War, that we entered a new world order, I say we entered a new world disorder. And in that complexity, we have found that, 80% of humanity is in a varying level of state of rage. We've seen extremism out of the Muslim world, and that rage what it's done. Nothing prevents the African world of 700 million to do exactly the same thing. And so rage based on poverty and lack of hope is there in the massive part of humanity. We are part of the 20% of the haves. I mean, we're off to Mars. We master technology. We pretentiously say that humanity is advancing because we're doing that, yet we're leaving behind 80% of humanity in inhuman conditions. Now, how can you do that? How can we be so bicéphale? We've seen what extremism and ethnic cleansing and genocide, we have seen people will go to any extreme of inhumanity to achieve their aims. Rwanda was not a tribal war. Rwanda was a war, civil war, based on people not wanting to share power, and they decided that how to keep power is to wipe out the other ethnic group in which they had to share power. And so they made a plan to slaughter 1.2 million people, and implemented it, and slaughtered over 700,000 of them. And so we've seen to what extreme inhumanity can go. We've seen global terrorism, and we've seen extremism. And that's gotten very close to home. And it has affected the psyche of the world power, which panicked and created all kinds of other traumas around it. The way we fiddle with our civil liberties back home, Patriot Act, or we have the equivalent, with our human rights, letting torture, with international conventions like Geneva, with Guantanamo Bay and things like that. We're going down the same road that the bad guys are going down in order to create our own protection. And is that the solution? So even back home, there's this uncertainty of where we should stand in regards to these conflicts, let alone if you're in the field. So if your 6 o'clock is not secure, that in itself doesn't create an atmosphere in which you can then function without having that sort of subtle stress behind you. And the nuclear weapon one is there not only in the big ones, but in the very small ones that are coming. And if there's something that is absolutely useless and ineffective in the world, it's that. That is an insult, an affront to our human right to security, the mere fact that those damn things still exist. So where do we go? We have seen massive abuses of human rights, from Rwanda to Darfur, that's still ongoing. And we have seen how the international community has not necessarily responded to it. But we have witnessed it. And we have hedged our bets in how we've met these challenges. And in so doing, we've created an enormous amount of dilemmas in how to handle these destruction. This is not high-tech stuff. This is low-tech stuff. But it's human-based. And there is where the trauma comes in all the more. The civilian populations are no more on the periphery of sort of classic war, where you have people on the periphery that, will see the war go by and then they sort of rebuild. The civilian population are part of the war. Rape is a war instrument. It's now a crime against humanity because it's torture, but rape is used as an instrument to create fear through horror. And so the nature of the beast has significantly changed, and as so doing, have we been able to anticipate it and to react to it. And not only have we sort of seen abuses of human rights on a massive scale, but we've also seen inventions of new weapons. I mean, how do you handle child soldiers? How many kids do you kill before it starts to affect you? 12-year-olds with AK-47s, 9, 10, 12, 14-year-olds, boys and girls. So how do you protect people when that's your mandate, when those coming at you are children, drugged up, fearful, indoctrinated, abused? And so in this circumstance, we've not only seen complex scenarios, but we've also seen new weapons being deployed massively and having to face them. And so is the way to handle children who are there and used as child soldiers by simply killing them? Is that the way? Do you kill children who kill, who've been abducted and used? And so there's a soldier of which I know a few, but one in particular who was in a patrol, where they went into a village and everybody had been killed except some in the church, and they were able to get them out, and they were calling for trucks to move them to a safe place. And as he's doing that from the side of the village, there's about 30 boys and girls, 9, 10, 12, 14, 16, open fire on the sergeant, his patrol, and the people he's protecting. And as he's reading from that, the other side of the village, there's about 20 girls, same ages, some of them are pregnant, and behind them, boys and girls shooting and firing at the sergeant, his patrol, and the people he's protecting. And the question is what does the sergeant do? I mean, what do you do? The bullets are flying. Do you kill children who kill? And so this one chap in particular, every now and again when it's a bad day, weather-wise, a sound, a smell, a noise, a conversation, falls into a state of PTSD, even though with the therapy and the medication. And he literally feels his finger pulling the trigger and feels the impact of the rifle going in, and with digitally clear and slow motion sees the cartridge flying out and looks through the sight and sees the head of a child exploding. Was that the right answer? How do you live with that? And how many do you do to achieve your mission? And so this creates incredible trauma because it goes against everything that we fundamentally have been brought up with as a reference. So it's not a pure military problem. It is a social problem. It is a problem of how do you adjust your culture, your background, your references to a conflict zone in which the use of force may be an answer, but not necessarily the one to be used.